On a stormy night, I stopped Simon Cooper, who was about to go find his mistress. "If you step out of this house tonight, we are truly over." He silently put down the car keys. The girl who couldn't wait for Simon raced her car in anger and ran a red light at midnight, crashing into a truck. Both she and her unborn child died. Simon was depressed for a few days until he saw me struggling with morning sickness and his eyes reddened. From then on, he was gentle and considerate to me in every way. When I was 5 months and 7 days pregnant, he suddenly pushed me down the stairs, looking down at me coldly. 5 months and 7 days, that's how old the baby in her belly was when she died. "If you hadn't stopped me, Cindy wouldn't have driven in anger because she couldn't reach me, and wouldn't have run the red light and been hit by a truck in the middle of the road. Estelle, debts must be repaid." The coldness of the concrete seeped into my flesh, chilling me to the bone. When I opened my eyes again, I was back on that stormy night, stepping aside to let Simon Cooper pass. Later, he knelt before me, his voice trembling as he asked, "Estelle, can we go back to how we were before?" Ding! This novel reminds you to click the subscribe button in the bottom right corner to read the complete novel. When I was coaxed into the hallway, I really thought Simon had prepared a wedding anniversary gift for me. But as soon as I stood still, a hand suddenly pushed me from behind. The sensation of falling hit me abruptly, and I tumbled down the stairs. The last thing I saw was Simon's expressionless face. The man who had spoken to me gently just days ago was now looking down at me coldly. Until he saw the dark red blood flowing from between my legs as he had hoped. He moved his lips, his tone as cruel as a messenger from hell. 5 months and 7 days, that's how old the baby in Cindy's belly was when she died. The sudden mention of her name made my head spin. Cindy was Simon's mistress who had died in a car accident a few months ago. And 5 months and 7 days. My hands instinctively protected my painfully cramping abdomen as I stared at the man standing above me in disbelief, hardly daring to trust my own ears. So, when he caressed my pregnant belly this morning and gently asked about the baby's age, the deep tenderness in his eyes was not out of a father's concern for his unborn child, but the calculated confirmation of a butcher, verifying the timing before executing his plan. Simon Cooper. He was taking revenge for Cindy with my child. But her child died because she ran a red light herself. What does that have to do with me? What does it have to do with you? Simon repeated each word slowly, his eyes filled with undisguised resentment and disgust. "If you hadn't stopped me, Cindy wouldn't have driven in anger because she couldn't reach me, and wouldn't have run the red light and been hit by a truck in the middle of the road." He stood indifferently above, his eyes filled with nothing but coldness and hatred. "Estelle, debts must be repaid." I was stunned. I couldn't understand how a wife asking her husband to end an affair out of family and responsibility could become a mistake. Yet the true culprit of the current situation could stand safely above, self-righteously acting as the guardian of his dirty love. But I didn't even have the strength to question him. The pain intensified, and I felt the small life that had accompanied me for 5 months slowly slipping away. I couldn't help but plead with him through my tears. "Simon, I beg you, call an ambulance for me, it's your child too." His response was cold and emotionless. "When you forced me to choose, did you think about the fact that Cindy was carrying my child too?" He said this and left. He didn't even spare a glance at me, drenched in cold sweat from the pain in my abdomen. His resolute and cold figure slowly disappeared behind the door. From beginning to end, he never looked back. Not even once. Cold sweat soaked my clothes, the chill of the concrete seeped into my flesh, chilling me to the bone. I was engulfed by darkness. In my drifting consciousness, I seemed to return to my wedding with Simon Cooper. The officiant read the vows from his card. "Bride, do you take Simon Cooper to be your lawfully wedded husband, to care for him, to cherish him, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health?" Opposite me, Simon, dressed in a suit, nervously swallowed, his eyes filled with light and affection as he looked at me. But gradually, those eyes became cold and ruthless. They merged with the Simon who stood impassively at the top of the stairs, watching me struggle. He approached me step by step, his hands wrapped around my neck, tightening. "Estelle, debts must be repaid." I gasped sharply. When I opened my eyes again, I was back on that stormy night. Simon and I were at a standoff at the door. "I promise you, This is the last time. Cindy is very emotionally unstable right now. I have to see her to be at ease. The notification sound from his phone kept urging him. He tried his best to control his anxiety, speaking to me in a gentle tone. But the veins bulging on the back of his tightly clenched fist had already given everything away. In my previous life, I was provoked by his restrained, worried expression for Cindy. And I forced Simon to choose between me and Cindy by bringing up our child and marriage. Think carefully, if you take one step out of this house today, it's really over between us. Simon didn't answer directly at that time. He just silently put down the car keys and went back to the room without a word. Unexpectedly, Cindy, unable to wait for Simon, decided to act recklessly. In a fit of anger, she sped through the streets in the heavy rain, running red lights. After running 5 red lights in a row, she collided with a large truck at the 6th red light intersection. The car was destroyed, and she died on the spot, taking 2 lives with her. After receiving the news of Cindy's death, Simon was depressed for a long time. Every night, he smoked desperately on the balcony. Until one night, he heard me crying in despair from pregnancy sickness by the toilet. He suddenly woke up from his daze and dropped his cigarette in a panic. He walked in quickly and held me. For the first time, the always calm and composed man had red eyes and trembling fingers as he wiped away my tears. "Estelle, it was my fault. I owe you an apology. Let's forget about all those things and live a good life from now on, okay?" At that moment, my desire for a complete family easily overshadowed all my inner resentment. I let my weak and soft body lean into Simon's warm embrace. It was like a silent forgiveness. As Simon had promised, from that day on, he took care of everything I needed during my pregnancy. He was gentle and considerate, taking care of me in every way. From time to time, he would place his hand on my belly and imagine the future with our child. The baby in my womb grew day by day. I really thought about turning a blind eye to the past and living a good life together as a family. But I never expected that the person beside me would irrationally blame Cindy's death entirely on me. All his love, guilt, and anxiety for his mistress turned into deep hatred for me. He hated me so much that even knowing how difficult my pregnancy was, he reached out for revenge without hesitation. He hated me so much that he pretended to be a loving husband for 3 months. Just to take revenge on me on the day I was 5 months and 7 days pregnant, the same stage Cindy's child would have been. His so-called kindness was nothing but arsenic wrapped in sugar. "Okay, go ahead." Before I even finished speaking, I had already stepped aside to let him out, walking past Simon without looking back and heading to the room. Simon was stunned for a moment upon hearing this and grabbed my arm. "What do you mean?" I thought he was quite unreasonable. When I tried to stop him from leaving, he found me annoying. Now that I let him go, he grabbed me to ask what I meant. What could I possibly mean? "From now on, no matter how many times you go, I won't stop you." I said it seriously. But Simon thought I was just being spiteful. So his expression turned impatient again. "Estelle, don't push your luck. I've already chosen you over her. What more do you want?" Chosen me? Did he really choose me? He also chose the half of his assets he didn't want to lose. He chose the image of a good husband he didn't want to give up. He chose the comfortable life he was used to being taken care of. It was all just the result of his weighing the pros and cons, and now he's grandiosely pushing everything onto me. I stopped in my tracks and peeled his fingers off my arm one by one. "I don't need your choice anymore, so go find your Cindy." He stared at me for a long time, then slammed the door on his way out. Before leaving, he threw back, "Fine, you said it. Don't regret it later." He didn't know, I had already regretted it. I regretted not cutting ties immediately when I found out he was cheating. I regretted fighting Cindy over such a worthless man. I booked an appointment for a gynecological checkup the next day on my phone. The moment the appointment was confirmed, a wave of indescribable helplessness washed over me. I just wanted an ordinary little family of 3, why was it so hard? From childhood, I was a child without a home. My parents divorced and started new families when I was very young. My dad disliked me for being a girl and didn't want me. My mom worried I would burden her life with her new husband, so she didn't take me either. At one point, they left me on the side of the road to fend for myself. It was a cadre on a rural visit who happened to pass by and used the law to force them to take on their parental responsibilities. Living under my stepmother's roof was not easy. Whenever she had a bad day, I would definitely be kicked out to sleep on the street. On my 7th birthday, because I didn't play horsey with my brother, my dad and stepmother teamed up to beat me and throw me out. The neighbor grandma felt sorry for me and gave me a small piece of leftover birthday cake from her granddaughter's party. In the cold wind, I clasped my hands together and silently made my first birthday wish. When I grow up, I must have a little family of my own and make up for all the warmth I missed as a child. Later, I met Simon in college. A shy and passionate young man held my hand tightly under the pear blossom tree and solemnly promised me, "Estelle, trust me, I will definitely give you a complete and warm home." The wind was gentle that day, lifting Simon's fringe. The determination and love in his eyes were more dazzling and warm than the afternoon sun. So, I believed him. Then, after just 6 years of marriage, I was left completely broken. I still remember it clearly. The first time in my previous life when I discovered the chat records between Simon and Cindy. How devastated I was. On the lit phone screen, Cindy was holding a milk tea, smiling playfully and cutely at the camera. Their conversation was full of warmth. In winter, with no one to warm my hands, I can only rely on hot milk tea to save me, so pitiful. "Don't worry, I'll come to keep you company tomorrow night, warm your hands and feet, won't let my baby freeze at all." In just 2 short sentences, the ambiguous and sticky atmosphere between a couple in love was easily depicted. At that time, it was only 3 hours after I found out that I was 3 weeks pregnant. Just a second ago, I was full of joy, planning how to share the happy news of my pregnancy with Simon. The next second, I was plunged into hell by his phone screen, which he forgot to lock. Great joy and great sorrow collided like a rampaging bull, dragging my emotions on a path of losing control. At the same time, my phone's message alert kept ringing. A photo of a 4-month pregnancy checkup ultrasound. And, "Hi, barren hen, take a look at your husband's child to make you a bit envious." No need to thank me for sharing the burden of childbirth, Simon has already thanked me well in other ways. Oh right, I forgot to remind you. Remember to clean the back seat of your SUV when you have time. During the day we couldn't help ourselves, we're all adults, you understand. I almost hysterically rushed into the bathroom and threw the phone at Simon's face. "Estelle, what the hell are you doing in the middle of the night?" Simon cursed, covering his nose, but fell silent when his eyes landed on his phone screen wet with water. The steam thickened the atmosphere in the bathroom. I cried while watching Simon's stiff expression and his eyes constantly avoiding mine, refusing to meet my gaze. I felt that the lover who had been with me for 10 years was terrifyingly unfamiliar. From school uniforms to wedding dresses with Simon, I genuinely believed we were the epitome of beautiful love. But I didn't realize, in the corners I couldn't see. Happiness had long been hollowed out by termites, leaving only a fragile illusion that would shatter at a touch. So when the truth finally came, the pain was like a decayed tooth reaching the nerve, a fatal blow whenever it flared up. That night, I screamed like a shrew. Even after I calmed down, my thoughts were still controlled by emotions of unwillingness. The only clear thought in my mind was, I would never let Cindy take away my family. Under the influence of sunk costs and extreme emotions, I clung desperately to the last thread holding my broken family together. But now, having lived again, I no longer had that extreme anger from being betrayed by my lover and provoked by the intruder in my past life. My heart seemed to be frozen by the howling north wind outside the window. Numb, leaving only indifference. Thus, reason finally broke through the walls of emotion. Some things, the moment they go bad, their fate is to be thrown into the trash. People are the same. So, the rotten Simon Cooper, I don't want him anymore. And for a family that is certain not to be happy, not having children is the greatest kindness I can offer. I had an appointment with a specialist at 10 in the morning, but I was called to the hospital a little after 3. Because Simon got into a car accident on his way to see Cindy. It was already pouring rain, the ground was slippery with water, and he was driving too fast. At a traffic light intersection, his tires skidded and he crashed into a truck. Heavy rain, traffic light intersection, truck. It was exactly the same setup as the accident Cindy had in the previous life. But Simon was much luckier than Cindy. He managed to steer in time and avoided the tragedy of being crushed under the truck. However, he couldn't dodge the falling objects from the truck. A rusty iron plate with a sharp edge pierced straight through the car roof, nearly severing one of his forearms. If I didn't hear it wrong, it was precisely the left hand that had pushed me down the stairs in the previous life. It was at this moment that I realized my heart wasn't entirely numb. At least in the second when I heard the doctor's notice. I truly felt the endorphins secreted by my pituitary gland, commonly known as pleasure. Simon's indifferent, condescending face from the previous life appeared before my eyes again. All right. I have to admit one thing. Actually, I am a petty, vindictive person. Every time I recall his cold, condescending look, I get annoyed. So I want to return the same expression to him. But just as I reached the door of the ward, I was blocked by his mother, who had been waiting outside early. She gritted her teeth and said, "You still have the face to come to the hospital?" I paused, pointed at the elevator, and asked in return, "Should I leave now?" Since Simon and I got married, his mother never showed me a good face. She thought I took her son away from her and found fault with everything I did. In the past, I didn't want Simon to be caught between me and his mother, so I always endured her unreasonable criticisms. But now, I only care about my own feelings. Simon's mother was choked by my words. After her chest heaved for a while, she continued to accuse me, pointing at my nose. "Your husband is lying in the operating room after a car accident. And here you are, leisurely strolling around as if you're at a shopping mall. If people didn't know better, they would think you were out for a walk. My son works hard every day to support the family, and what he gets in return is an ungrateful wretch. It's raining heavily in the middle of the night, and you didn't stop your husband from going out. How did my son end up marrying such a jinx like you?" Covering my mouth, I lazily yawned. Her face turned red with anger, and her finger almost poked my eye. "Estelle, are you listening to me?" I slapped her hand away. "Before accusing others, why don't you ask your good son who he was going to meet late at night? I'd like to ask you, how did you raise your son that he can't even maintain basic fidelity in marriage, truly?" I elongated my tone and finished lightly in her furious gaze. "The apple doesn't fall far from the tree." Simon's mother had divorced years ago after being caught cheating. Being subtly reminded of this disgrace by the daughter-in-law she despised, she trembled, pointing at me repeatedly saying "you," but couldn't say anything coherent. The elevator arrival sound chimed. Cindy came out of the elevator, holding her belly with a worried look on her face. "Mrs. Cooper, how is Simon? Walk slowly, be careful of the baby." Seeing Cindy, Simon's mother immediately changed her harsh demeanor. "Simon just had a car accident, you mustn't have any problems now." She stood protectively in front of Cindy, her eyes wary as she looked at me. I was somewhat stunned. So, as early as this time, Cindy had already infiltrated the Cooper family. No wonder in my previous life, Mrs. Cooper ignored my pregnancy. It wasn't until shortly after that car accident that she slowly started to care about me, persuading Simon to live well with me. The more I thought about it, the more shocked I became. I even reasonably suspected that Simon agreeing to cut ties with Cindy and asking her to abort the child was just a stalling tactic aimed at me. He couldn't let go of Cindy, nor could he let go of the vast family fortune I held. He could only take a step back and plan slowly. If it weren't for that car accident, I fear I would have ended up being kicked out with nothing. Even with that car accident, my end wasn't much better. Simon Cooper truly is a businessman. What a calculation! And what was I thinking at that time? I was thinking that as long as he was willing to come back home, I could pretend nothing had happened and continue to live my life with him. How foolish of me! Coldness crept into my eyes as I mockingly watched the two people sweetly embracing by the bedside in the hospital room. Simon lay weakly on the hospital bed. His gaze towards the tear-streaked Cindy was full of pity, and the joy of regaining what was lost. "All right, stop crying. Seeing you cry makes my heart ache, and the baby in your belly should be protesting too. Speaking of which, I have to thank this car accident. If it weren't for this experience, I fear I would never have realized who I truly love." He looked up at me standing by the door. The eyes that were warm and tender just a moment ago turned into cold, piercing swords when they fell on me. If looks could kill, I would have died under that gaze. Just one look. I knew that the Simon from my previous life had returned. Cindy followed his gaze and turned around. Out of his sight, she provocatively raised an eyebrow, then turned back with a pitiful, trembling posture. "Mrs. Cooper is here, I should." Her action of getting up was interrupted by the man's hand pressing down on her back. Simon pulled her into his arms, gave me a cold glance, and said, "Ignore her, soon she won't be Mrs. Cooper anymore. You will be my future Mrs. Cooper." Cindy immediately looked up in surprise. "Really? You want to divorce her and marry me?" The woman's eyelashes still held undried tears, making her dark, round pupils look even more watery and pitiful. She was irresistibly endearing. Simon instinctively wanted to raise his left hand to wipe the tears for his beloved. But as he raised it, "Where's my hand? Where did my left hand go?" I blinked and couldn't help but laugh out loud. In all the time I'd known Simon, it was the first time I'd seen him so panicked. No wonder he could say something as absurd as "I have to thank the car accident." Turns out he hadn't realized that one of his arms had been lost in the car accident. I walked step by step to the bedside, crossed my arms over my chest, and looked down at Simon's noticeably shortened left limb. I softly told him, "Your hand is gone. Just as you said." I restrained my smile, staring directly into his eyes that were trembling from the sudden shock. Returning his words to him exactly, "Debts that you owed must be repaid." Unable to accept his own suddenly disabled body, Simon's eyes were wide with rage, clenching his teeth and shaking his head in denial. "No, this is impossible." But the severed left limb was right in front of him. No matter how much he deceived himself, he couldn't escape the ironclad evidence. After a long time, he slowly raised his head. He asked me, "Why didn't you stop me last night?" I almost laughed out of anger. "Simon Cooper, just how low do you think I am? Stop you last night only to be pushed down the stairs by you 3 months later? Your legs are on your own body. You insisted on speeding in the rain. When you hit the gas pedal, you should have been prepared to bear all possible consequences. Wasn't all of this his own fault?" Apparently, the person involved didn't think so. Thinking of something, Simon suddenly turned his head and lashed out at Cindy. "It's all your fault, you witch. If it weren't for you making a fuss for me to come find you, how would I have lost an arm for no reason?" As if he had finally found the culprit, Simon became emotional as he spoke. He even went so far as to strangle Cindy. "Didn't you say that if I didn't come to accompany you, you would kill yourself and the baby? Fine, go ahead and die. If you die, maybe none of this would have happened, and I could go back to having a whole body." His fingers tightened continuously. Cindy's face turned red due to lack of oxygen, her hands weakly pushing against the man's hands gripping her neck. It wasn't until the doctor arrived, quickly administering a sedative to him, that the farce ended. I and another patient from the next room who had come to watch the commotion saw it all. "Is he your husband?" she asked. I nodded. "Luckily, he cheated on you," she sighed. I always felt that this statement was strange, but upon reflection, it made sense. Simon Cooper, pinned to the hospital bed, was still glaring venomously at the limp Cindy on the floor. The malice in his eyes was even more intense than how he looked at me in the past life. How ironic. In the last life, he had even harmed the child in my womb for Cindy, and just a few minutes ago, he declared her as his true love. In a blink of an eye, his true love had become someone he wanted dead. Only then did I fully realize. Simon Cooper had no true love at all. From beginning to end, he only loved one person. Himself. A person so selfish would never find fault with themselves. I looked at Simon, gradually calming down under the effect of the medication, and only one thought remained in my mind. I must divorce quickly. But I didn't expect the situation to develop so quickly and unexpectedly. On the 5th day after I had just undergone an abortion, Simon, who was supposed to continue his treatment in the hospital, suddenly appeared at home. Ah! I was startled by the sudden appearance of a figure on the sofa when I opened the door to get some water. Clutching my wildly beating heart, I slowly calmed the aching in my lower abdomen. "When did you come back? Why didn't you make a sound?" He neither spoke nor turned around, just sat on the sofa with his head slightly lowered, motionless. It was eerily quiet. I didn't take his abnormality to heart. My mind was filled with thoughts of whether or not to bring up the divorce agreement. After consulting a lawyer in the past few days, I learned that if I really wanted to go through a divorce lawsuit, my chances of winning were not high, and if I lost, I would have to wait 6 more months to file again. I didn't want to waste too much more time on Simon. As I hesitated and sat down on the sofa, Simon made the first move. He suddenly got up and knelt in front of me, trembling as he asked, "Estelle, can we go back to how things were before?" I didn't know when the curtains had been drawn, leaving only a narrow gap in the middle through which light faintly seeped. In the dim and shifting shadows, I saw Simon's right hand hanging by his side, trembling uncontrollably. A shadow of gloom flashed across his ambiguous brows and eyes. The nerve in my brain named intuition instantly tightened. Of course, I wouldn't naively think he had a change of heart towards me in just a few days. The man's gentle words of reconciliation sounded more like a venomous snake hissing to me, poised and ready to strike. After waiting a long time without my response, he slowly lifted his right hand and placed it on my lower abdomen. His tone was so tender it was absurd. "In my past life, I was blinded by that which Cindy, and that's why I hurt you and our child. Since God has given us a chance to start over, let's cherish it and make up for the regrets of our past life, okay?" But my regret from my past life was not seeing his true colors sooner and leaving earlier. Through my belly, Simon's trembling right hand became even clearer. I didn't know what had happened between him and Cindy, but for my own safety, I could only go along with his words. I lowered my eyes to hide the emotions brewing in them. I tried to make my voice sound as if his words had truly softened my attitude. "Really? Do you really not love Cindy anymore? You don't believe me?" His voice ended with a laugh. But it made him, shrouded in shadow, even more sinister and terrifying. "Then I'll prove it to you." As he finished speaking, he lifted his head. The sickly madness on his face was clearly displayed before me. My instinct was to flee, but the moment I stood up, Simon hooked his arm around my neck. The disparity in strength between a man and a woman was starkly evident at this moment. If he exerted just a bit of force, I could suffocate in the crook of his arm. Fortunately, Simon didn't intend to harm me just yet. He half-dragged, half-carried me out the door, step by step towards the fire escape where he had pushed me down the stairs in our past life. The plain fire door was kicked open by Simon. The lights in the corridor vied to illuminate the dark stairwell. Light and shadow blended into a dim hue, and I saw Cindy lying in a pool of blood, her mouth gagged and her hands tied. The woman curled up on the ground in pain, her face deathly pale. Her eyes lit up when she saw me, only to be extinguished in the shadow cast by Simon as the light hit him. But her mouth kept moving, pleading word by word. "Save me, save my child." The desperate and helpless memories from my past life were stirred up. And I strained my neck to try and call for help, but Simon anticipated it and tightened his arm sharply. The overwhelming sensation of suffocation choked off my voice. Simon threatened viciously in my ear, "If you make a sound, I'll strangle you right now." Seeing me nod, he slightly loosened his grip. He seemed to be waiting for something, trying hard to steady his breathing. Time ticked by slowly, and below, Cindy had long since fainted from the pain. Why isn't it working this time?" I heard Simon's impatient muttering in my ear. "In the last life, I pushed you down just like this, and shortly after, I was reborn. Why isn't anything happening this time?" My heart sank. He was using Cindy and her child to recreate the trigger for his rebirth from the past life. "Are you crazy? If you keep dragging this out, she will die. I just want my hand to be intact. As for everything else, as long as I can find a chance for rebirth, everything will start over, won't it?" Simon's deep gaze lingered on my face. "But it seems that Cindy's child is not that opportunity. The venomous snake, spitting its fangs, finally set its sights on me, then let's try yours." "That's impossible." I calmly turned my head. 5 days ago, I already lost the child. "You'll never get the chance to go back." His face showed a moment of shock. In that brief moment of distraction, I tightened my grip on the key and plunged it deep into his unhealed limb. The cross-shaped key pierced through layers of gauze and into the flesh. Simon's face changed with pain. The arm that was constricting my neck instantly tightened its muscles. I didn't care, I twisted the key inside his flesh. "Ah, wretch!" In unbearable pain, Simon forcefully threw me off and knelt on the ground, clutching his left arm. Ignoring the dizziness from my head hitting the wall, I aimed for the most vulnerable spot on a man and kicked without mercy. It should have hurt more than being pierced by the key. Because this time, Simon collapsed to the ground, wide-mouthed, unable to let out a sound. Once I confirmed he couldn't get up, I hurried back home and grabbed my phone to call the police. The ambulance and police arrived quickly. But at the entrance of the hallway, there was no sign of Simon Cooper. He escaped again. Since that day, it felt like I had a time bomb buried in me, always on edge and wary of my surroundings no matter where I went. I didn't know when Simon would jump out from a corner to take revenge on me again. I hadn't slept well for several nights. The next day, I visited Cindy in the hospital. She ultimately lost the child in her womb, and due to missing the best treatment window, her uterus was completely removed. She would never have her own children for the rest of her life. "What's wrong? Are you here to see my joke?" I shook my head. "Do I need to see you to see a joke? Am I not another joke myself?" Falling for a hypocritical and selfish person like Simon, anyone would turn into a joke. But Cindy was not innocent either. At first, she had a boyfriend who would rather drop out of school to support her education. He worked 3 jobs a day without complaining, saving every penny except for basic living expenses, which he deposited into Cindy's phone account. Unfortunately, the splendor of the big city fed her vanity. Used to seeing men in suits, she could no longer look at her honest boyfriend covered in mud. And after going to great lengths to climb up to Simon, she ruthlessly kicked him aside. As she left, she even humiliated the man who pleaded with her. As a result, not long after she left, the man ended his life with a bottle of pesticide. Knowing what kind of fiery personality the woman in front of me had, I casually stoked the flames in her ear. "You're also miserable. Simon, who claims to love you, can easily push you down the stairs. Do you regret giving up your former boyfriend, who loved you so much, for him?" Cindy remained silent. But in her eyes, fixed on her hand full of needle holes, something dark was brewing. She wouldn't let him off. In the previous life, she was someone who would risk her life to force Simon to accompany her. Speeding through a stormy night, how could she easily swallow this grievance? Extreme people are the most ruthless. I waited for her and him to fight each other. Unexpectedly, the first person I waited for was Simon Cooper. But after letting my guard down once out of a stroke of luck, I found myself cornered in an alley. The man swung a small folding knife in his hand as he slowly approached me. "Estelle, I really underestimated you. I thought you were just a woman obsessed with love, but it turns out you can be just as ruthless as a man." He exuded an undeniable fierceness. The corner of his mouth curled up in a smirk. "Did you enjoy kicking me that day? You certainly showed no mercy." "Don't worry," he raised the knife, "I won't show you any mercy today either. You ruined my life, so you'd better pay with your life." As he spoke, he took a large step forward. Even now, Simon was blaming all his misfortunes on others. It was time for that to end. Behind me was a dead end. I had nowhere to retreat, my back pressed against the moss-covered wall. My gaze drifted to behind him, then snapped back in an instant. "Simon," I kindly reminded him, "watch out behind you." But he didn't listen, sneering, "I'm not falling for that childish trick." The knife plunged into his body from behind, and the man froze mid-motion, slowly turning his head. Cindy stood expressionless behind him. Seeing him turn around, she pulled out the knife and drove it back in. "Simon, you deserve to die." I don't remember how many times Simon was stabbed in the end. I only recall the sound of sirens echoing through the deserted alley that night. Blood washed over the old moss on the ground, leaving a stain of dark red that couldn't be erased. Later, I learned that since being discharged from the hospital, Cindy had been secretly following me. She knew Simon wouldn't let me go, so waiting by my side was the most efficient way to track down the elusive Simon. She succeeded, avenging herself with her own hands. But the price was her own life. Cindy was sentenced to death. Mrs. Cooper couldn't bear the blow of losing her son and turned white-haired overnight, returning to her hometown. As for me, I inherited most of Simon's fortune.